My name is David Hayes. I'm the Executive Director of the new State Energy and Environmental Impact Center here at NYU Law School. And we're very fortunate to have three state attorney generals with us. If you will bear with me for a couple of minutes at the top of this program, I want to set the frame a little bit for the critical role that state attorneys general like the three prominent AGs to my left, play in addressing clean energy, environment, and climate change issues. And then I'm going to give a short commercial for our new State Impact Center. So I think all of you know that state attorneys general have traditionally played a really key role in addressing health and environmental issues arising in their states, as well as affecting regional and national policy. On the health side of the equation, for example, it was attorneys general from virtually all of the states acting in concert that helped bring home tobacco reform in the 1990s. AGs sued the tobacco industry for the recovery of tobacco-related health care costs, and in a multi-state settlement, received more than $200 billion for their constituents in monetary relief from the industry, along with agreements to curtail tobacco advertising. Likewise, in more recent years, state attorneys general have been at the forefront of climate change advocacy. It was state attorney generals that turned to the Supreme Court in Massachusetts v. EPA and its progeny, including Connecticut versus American Electric Power, to obtain judicial confirmation of Clean Air Act jurisdictional coverage for greenhouse gas emissions. And we know how important that is today. Thank you, state AGs, for that work and that ongoing work. And even more recently, state attorneys general, including those on the stage, have been particularly active with the change of administrations in Washington, promoting clean efficiency and clean energy, forthrightly addressing climate change causes and impacts, and defending environmental protections. State AGs are fighting on many fronts against rollbacks of Clean Water Act regulations, coal industry carbon emissions, oil and gas methane emissions, efforts to go around Congress and unilaterally lift Antiquities Act protections on some of our most spectacular national monuments. And you'll hear more from the AGs themselves about what they're doing in this area. Now, a consistent theme is that state attorneys general are fighting not just for the environmental values that we all cherish, but for application of the rule of law. Time and again, this administration has been making abrupt, unexplained reversals of regulations that were constructed on a fact and science-based administrative record that has benefited from public input and scrutiny. This will not do. California's and New Mexico's attorneys general, for example, recently challenged the attempt to wipe out regulations that cure abusive practices that coal and oil and gas companies employed to avoid paying royalties associated with the extraction of public resources. The General Accountability Office and others had documented the abuses and the losses to American taxpayers and state coffers in the tens of millions of dollars. The Trump administration has no replacement plan that's responsive to these documented abuses. They simply want to return to the status quo ante without regard to the extensive public rulemaking record that undergirds the reforms. And that's not how the law works. Likewise, President Trump summarily deep-sixed the federal flood risk management standard, which determines how federal FEMA funds will be spent in rebuilding after major flood events. Based on the lessons of Hurricane Sandy and the latest climate science, the standard had been upgraded to account for higher potential sea rise and storm surge events. But without any rationale, and 2 weeks before Hurricane Harvey hit Houston, the president rejected the upgraded standard, opening the door to the possibility that literally billions of federal FEMA dollars will be spent reconstructing infrastructure that can't handle the higher flood risks that are accompanying climate change. It is this type of serious threat to clean energy, climate change, and environmental values, combined with the impermissible shortcuts that the administration has been taking to push a one-sided agenda, that prompted a number of state AGs, including the ones to my left, to come together with Bloomberg Philanthropies and the NY School of Law, and the ever-present Ricky Revesz to form the State Energy and Environmental Impact Center. So now for my very short commercial before I introduce our distinguished guests. So the State Energy and Environmental Impact Center, we call it the State Impact Center for short because the acronym is terrible. We are designed to support state attorneys general in defending and promoting clean energy, climate, and environmental laws and policies. We are nonpartisan, but we are unabashedly progressive in terms of advancing legal and policy positions on clean energy, climate, and environmental matters. Now, as we gear up, we hope to work with the attorney generals in a number of ways. First, by providing direct legal assistance through our center here at NYU to interested AGs on specific administrative, judicial, or legislative matters involving these subjects, with a focus in particular on areas of regional and national significance. We are also working with interested attorneys general to identify and hire NYU law fellows, as many as 13 of them, who will serve as special assistant attorney generals in state AG offices focusing on clean energy, climate, and environmental matters. We will have an announcement soon of some of the states in which these fellows will have the opportunity to work for AGs like the distinguished folks on my left. We hope to help coordinate efforts across multiple state AG offices and with other parties that may be aligned with their interests, including identifying and coordinating outside lawyers who are interested in working on a pro bono basis with AGs on specific matters. We hope to serve as a centralized source of information for ongoing initiatives, and through our in-house communications resources, helping to enhance the public's understanding of the importance of the clean energy, climate change, and environmental matters that attorneys general are handling. And in that regard, we hope to leverage strategic communications to lift up the work of state AGs and shine a light on the seemingly mundane yet critical actions taken or not taken by the administration that undermine environmental protections and renewable energy and contribute to climate change. So I'd like to do a quick shout out here for two key members of the State Impact Center's team. Liz Klein is the Deputy Director. Please raise your hand, Liz, back there in the corner. And we have a new Communications Director who just joined us from Javier Becerra's office, Chris Moyer. Chris, where are you? Thank you. This is Chris's second day. And we're also honored to be guided by a distinguished advisory council, headed up by Ricky Revesz. Where is Ricky? There he is. Thank you. Man who clearly needs no introduction. And I should say also that Ricky's Policy Integrity Institute, which is sponsoring this conference, is a wonderful sister organization now here at NYU Law School, because that organization has drilled deep into many of the issues that are prominent for the state attorney generals in the defense and in their initiatives against some of the rollbacks on the environmental side. So we're looking forward to a very close relationship with the policy integrity. Joining Ricky on the advisory council are two former state attorneys general, Ann Milgram, former AG of New Jersey. Ann is here, I believe. Okay, she was, but she'll be back, I'm sure. She now teaches here at NYU, among other things, and Bruce Babbitt, the former AG of Arizona, who later served as governor of Arizona, secretary of the Department of the Interior, couldn't be here today. He's on the advisory council. And Dan Ferger, the environmental program officer at Bloomberg Philanthropies, is on our advisory council. Thank you, Dan. And a big thank you to Bloomberg Philanthropies that is supporting this very significant venture. So I now want to introduce our three attorneys general who are with us today. Our plan is to hear from each of them. They'll come up to the podium and give a few minutes of highlights of what they are doing in this space, and they're doing a lot, as you will find out. We'll then, after that, sit down here and have a Q&A session where I will ask a number of questions, and we'll have an interesting discussion, and then we will also solicit your questions through the procedure you've been using here to put your questions on cards and bring them up. So we'll have a very interesting time. So I am going to give short shrift to these introductions because the bios are in the program materials, but let me say a word or two about the three state attorneys general who are here. Our host attorney general here from New York State, Eric Schneiderman, was elected in November of 2010. He's pursued an incredibly broad and ambitious agenda on a number of fronts. Corrupt politicians, look out. Companies who have defrauded New Yorkers, look out, including Trump University, by the way. Financial institutions who helped cause the financial crisis. Yes, Department of Justice didn't move very quickly, but Eric Schneiderman did. Thank you for that, Eric. And for today's purposes, he is appropriately in the lead seat here because he has been the undisputed lead of state attorneys general in the climate change, energy, and environmental space. From his leadership with the Volkswagen cheating scandal, which yielded $32 million for New Yorkers, to fighting tirelessly on behalf of the Waters of the United States rule, for the Clean Power Plan rule, for intervening in the methane, oil, and gas proceeding. He likes to tell the story, and it's true that the day after Eric led the intervention motion, Scott Pruitt stepped back and said, well, maybe we're not going to try to put off all of those new source performance standard requirements for methane, oil, and gas. And he's taken on ExxonMobil on the climate change science piece, as well as DOE energy efficiency rules. The list goes on and on. But also, Eric, from the very beginning, was a key part of this effort, of the notion of bringing state attorneys general together in this area and leveraging the combined resources across the states to take on the big issues that are a particular threat to the constituents of not only New York State, but all states. His relationships with Mike Bloomberg and others have been central to all of this working out. So we're really so grateful for Eric and his leadership. Lisa Madigan is the most senior female state attorney general in the country. She has been the AG for Illinois since 2003. She has been a tireless advocate for consumers, for protecting children and women from the dangers of sexual predators. She's been engaged in the ongoing public fight for open and accessible government in a state that's needed that. And she's had a major focus on protecting Illinois' air, water, and land from pollution. She's advocated in particular in the clean energy side for stronger air emission standards for electric power plants and motor vehicles, worked on energy efficiency, renewable energy, carbon reduction technology, and she's had her eye on the enforcement ball throughout her tenure. She brought the largest Clean Air Act enforcement case successfully to conclusion in state history, and brought a famous and important Clean Water Act enforcement action that I remember reading about in my academic world against the village of Crestwood, which had knowingly used a contaminated well to serve contaminated water to its citizens. So Lisa has been a terrific leader as well, and I'm particularly excited based on previous recent conversations with her about her leadership in the clean energy space. Brian Frosh is our third AG here today. Brian is the Attorney General for the state of Maryland. He comes to that job after serving for 28 years in the Maryland General Assembly, the last 12 of which in the state Senate. And when he was in the Senate and throughout his state career, he was always known as an environmental champion. In particular, he's been a longstanding protector of the Chesapeake Bay. He has been unflailingly working on preserving open space, cleaning up air pollution. He was chair of the Senate's Environment Subcommittee for 8 years, from 1995 to 2003. He's chaired the Chesapeake Bay Commission and served on the commission for many years. He's gotten awards including Public Official of the Year from the Audubon Society, Conservationist of the Year from the Sierra Club, the John Cavler Memorial Award by the Maryland League of Conservation Voters. And Brian has been from the beginning another strong advocate for this enterprise that we're trying out here, the notion of having a somewhat more coordinated effort among state attorneys general, and from the beginning was supportive of NYU Law School being the home for the new center. So enough of my filibustering. I present to you Eric Schneiderman.
Thank you very much, David. That wasn't filibustering. I'll show you filibustering. No, I will try to be brief because this should be a terrific conversation. But I do want to start off by saying, first of all, I'm very proud to have this gathering in New York. We have a tradition of over 100 years old of always at least seeking to be the most aggressively progressive state in the country. And the project that is being launched now at NYU is very much in keeping with that tradition, and it's great to have everyone together here in New York. This is a moment of change in America, and David, thank you for that introduction and for your leadership in launching the Institute, and thanks to Ricky for hosting us here today. This is a very, very critical step in what I think history will regard as a very important moment in which there was the emergence of a new kind of progressive federalism in the United States, where the collapse of agencies of the federal government and the unwillingness of Congress to stay the excesses of an administration resulted in more of a burden and more of a challenge being posed to state actors. And I'm extremely proud of the work that the Coalition of State Attorneys General I work with, and Lisa Madigan and Brian Frosh, key among them, have done to rise to this occasion. So we are here today with NYU putting the academic notions of progressive federalism into action through providing the resources of the Institute. This is a tremendously important step, and I'm very, very proud to be here with you today. I don't think it's worth beating around the bush in this situation. We have some big problems ahead of us and a lot of hard work to do. We are trying to stop the transformation of agencies that have for decades, under Republican and Democratic administrations, been dedicated to public health, clean air, clean water, management of our natural resources, to a group of people whose efforts to ensure dirtier air, more polluted water, and a less hospitable planet might use the motto, "Make America Grimy Again." But with the new administration clearly in the pockets of the fossil fuel industry, the chemical industry, and others, and putting people in power who deny the most basic science, it's very important to recognize the brilliance of our federalist system, that there is this second tier of protection at the state level. And this is something that has been debated in academia for some time, and sometimes liberal academics have been suspicious of state power and state sovereignty, associating it with resistance to the civil rights movement back in the old days. We're way beyond that. That's ancient history. And if we do not engage at the state level, if we do not exercise our progressive federalist muscles, the country will suffer greatly. So I'm very pleased to say that starting really the first week of this administration in January, there was a galvanizing moment for a group of state attorneys general realizing that this was on us now. And we came together. The first galvanizing experience was at the end of his first week in office, when the president issued his first anti-Muslim travel ban, which came out on a Friday afternoon. And by Sunday morning, we had 17 attorneys general representing more than 130 million people to say, Jeff Sessions is not going to tell you the truth about the rule of law, but we are. This is unconstitutional, it's un-American, we will go into courts all over the country and stop it, and we did. And then we stopped the second travel ban, and there was a great sense of we're all in this together. We went into different courts, but then we figured out who had the best shot to get a national injunction. People pulled back. Remarkable lack of ego for elected officials. We got the second injunction in Hawaii, and now we just got the third travel ban, because we beat them on both of the first two, so now we're reviewing that one. But that galvanizing experience led us to start coordinating and collaborating in a way we never have before. And there's no area in which this is more important than in fighting for our environment and our planet, because the climate change deniers and industry activists, which is really what they are, who've been put in charge, are trying to everything they can do to dial back, delay, and dilute every possible protection for our people from the dangers of environmental degradation. Now, and I see in this audience a lot of young faces, but I'm old enough to remember when I was a kid in New York City, and ash literally rained down from the sky from garbage fires. Companies dumped toxic chemicals openly into New York Harbor. The smog was so bad that on Thanksgiving Day in 1966, 200 people died from smog. So we have seen what the planet is like when we let it go, and I can assure you, we are committed, and I believe the vast majority of the American people are committed to never letting us go back that way again, and that's why we're gathered here today. So in order to succeed in this, with the loss of these federal agencies that we have labored hard, and many have labored hard to set up, it's going to take a different kind of a coalition of innovative leaders. And state attorneys general are at the core of what I call the legal resistance, but the coalition is broad. We have activists, scientists, great nonprofits, community leaders, and with the steps taken today, law schools stepping up to join the coalition as we develop innovative strategies for stop blocking bad proposals and going into court to try and do what we can do to derail any of these plans. We are now in many ways, state attorneys general, more of a check on the excesses of this administration than Congress. And given what's going on in Congress, that is probably a lucky thing. We have had, I also have to say, some real successes. And it's very important to get the word out about success. I'm sure you know people who are so traumatized by the situation that they have problems engaging. And if you can shut down their Twitter accounts, that might help them. It's hard not to get distracted, but when you have a week of threats of nuclear war, untold natural disasters, partly attributable to the changes, to our changing climate, and everyone spends the entire weekend talking about whether or not football players stand up or kneel down. We're dealing not just with malevolence, but we're dealing with a level of frenzy and craziness. Actually, there was an article written about our litigation with the Trump administration that was entitled "Malevolence Tempered by Incompetence," which kind of captures, to me, the zeitgeist of the moment. So from my point of view, I've defined for the folks in our office, and we're joined by Lem Stralovic, the head of my Environmental Protection Bureau, others from my bureau, and quite a few alums of the New York State Attorney General's office who've gone on to do great things in this area. I've really defined our work in three ways. We can fill in, we can fight back, and we also have to move forward. And I want to give you some examples of what I mean by that. We can fill in by enforcing not just state, but also federal environmental laws. This is something that is tremendously important. The Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act are designed with federalist systems very specifically in mind. And states do have a lot of ability to fill in where the federal government doesn't work. We also have state environmental laws that can be very important. The work on the Clean Power Plan is an example of us literally filling in, because I've been working with and putting together, and now we have a coalition of 24 states and local governments, including my colleagues here, that have intervened to defend the Clean Power Plan, because we have a strong belief that the Sessions Justice Department will not defend the Clean Power Plan. So we are literally filling in for the federal government, and that's something that the Clean Power Plan really is the result of actions by state attorneys general. There's a long history of cases going back. We pushed first the Bush administration and then the Obama administration. So this is not a partisan thing. My office actually sent a notice of intent to sue the Obama-era EPA because they were going too slowly to regulate greenhouse gases. The settlement of that resulted in the Clean Power Plan and the new plant rule, which are these really the most important collective efforts for us to deal with the existential crisis of climate change in American history. And now our coalition is united to support the Clean Power Plan and to defend it against attacks. It is tremendously important. It would reduce pollution and have the equivalent effect of taking 70% of our cars off the roads. These are tremendously important programs. So we have challenged them, and the good news I have for you is that I think we've already established that under existing law, they are under an obligation to have regulations for greenhouse gas emissions. This is not something they can just get rid of. And as I often say, because I know it drives them crazy, if you repeal it, you have to replace it. And you guys don't seem to be very good at doing repeal and replace these days. So we are there literally filling in for the federal government. Second, we can fill in, but we can also fight back. And we've already challenged Scott Pruitt and other climate change deniers in charge of important programs in their efforts, somewhat crude efforts in terms of administrative law, they don't like a rule that's coming into effect, so they say, well, we'll just put in a one-year delay on that. And we've gone into court repeatedly to stop them. David mentioned the methane rule. We also went in when they were trying to delay vital standards to increase energy efficiency for major consumer and commercial appliances. We forced them to reverse course for several categories of appliances and are fighting on the others. And when they tried to delay designating areas where more needed to be done to deal with the problem of ozone pollution or smog, something that is important to me as a New Yorker, whereas to this day, 1 out of 3 New Yorkers is breathing air that has too much smog in it. We sued them, and they immediately reversed course. So we've won some in court, we've won some where they were afraid to go to court, and we will continue to do so. But in addition to filling in and fighting back, we are never going to succeed. We can win some battles. We will not win the war if we only play defense. So I would urge you, we can't just be about resisting what the administration is doing and fighting back. We also have to fight forward. We have to show that progress is possible. And the best modeling of progressive policies in this next few years is going to be at the state level. And it's tremendously important to provide support for that also. Progressive federalism, which I'm sure we'll talk more about as we go on today, provides us with a powerful set of tools to check bad federal policies and to model good, smart, effective policies at the state level. We're very proud of the work we did in New York to set up the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, which is a combination of New York and 8 other states, and we hope to get New Jersey back once they have regime change in January. And I was very proud to work on setting up RGGI when I was in the state Senate and to successfully defend it against a series of attacks in court. This plan, by cutting down on power generation from fossil fuels and investing in renewable energy and energy efficiency, has been able to lower prices and reduce regional CO2 emissions from the power sector by 45% since 2005, in spite of the fact we've had significant growth since then. So that's a big deal. It's a national model we should be proud of. Also, and this didn't get as much attention, but our fight against microbeads was a great example of states showing how you can shift a national debate. In 2015, my office released a a groundbreaking report showing how these little toxic sponges were passing through our wastewater plants because they're so small, getting into our fish, getting into our water stream, and ultimately causing a tremendous amount of damage. So we started to try and move legislation at the state level. Then we went city by city, county by county, working with advocates and community leaders, passed local laws and resolutions. We put pressure on manufacturers and got some of them to change their policies. We worked to promote the development of alternative products. And then we took the effort national, and our state and several others around the country had done such a good job shifting the debate that working with Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, we ultimately got so many in the industry to say we're willing to change that they passed a federal law banning microbeads. So these are the kinds of things you can do at the state level. You can model procedures, and you can change the national debate by showing what can be done and setting examples at the state level. So our commitment to you is this. Our coalition of attorneys general is only getting stronger. Our work together is only getting more effective and efficient. The smoothness with which we're operating has really been a great pleasure. And I also do have to say, we have been getting a lot of support from nonprofits, but from the bar in general, private law firms. There is a certain level of offense at the total disregard for the rule of law evinced by this administration that I see lawyers who are it's not a matter of liberal versus conservative. This is a matter of believing in the rule of law or not. And I'm very, very proud to be a lawyer. I always am, but particularly now. And the defense of the rule of law is becoming popular even among people who used to tell lawyer jokes. Not so much anymore now that we have a president who doesn't seem to really, if he has lawyers, he certainly doesn't seem to consult them. This is what you call a nightmare client if you're in private practice. But our commitment to you is strong, and the steps that are being taken here by NYU to really take the most important step that has been taken so far by a law school in making the ideas of progressive federalism real and really providing the real support to state attorneys general is a great example of leadership. I hope others will follow your lead, but we're here in this together. The future of our planet is at stake. And those of us who act at the state level and all of you who are our allies have a lot on our plate, but I have a great deal of faith in the coalition we're building. It is an honor to be here today with you, and I look forward to hearing my colleagues and then questions from all of you. Thank you. Now, Attorney General Lisa Madigan.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I want to say thank you for bringing us together. So in particular, thank you to Ricky for being our host here at NYU. Thank you to the Bloomberg Philanthropies for funding this initiative. David, thank you for reaching out. I have had an opportunity to be here all day since I flew in from Chicago. So I have been sitting at a table over there and observing a great bunch of what I am going to refer to as experts. You are the people who truly are driving a lot of the change that is taking place throughout the country, and it is it's good to have an attorney general sit and to listen to that, because I have a lot of people in my office who do that work, and we are dependent and reliant on the information that you are able to gather and synthesize for us as we make our decisions moving forward on all of these issues. So thank you for having me be here and be able to participate. So I am very happy to be able to share my perspective. As you heard in David's introduction, I have served as the Illinois Attorney General since 2003. So I have been where we find ourselves today before. I started when Bush was president, and we weren't able to be as we were during the Obama administration on the offensive, but instead we're playing a lot of defensive work. And so I have seen some of the trends. I have seen the fact that in spite of being on the defensive, we also can achieve tremendous success in terms of environmental issues. Let me give you a really quick overview of what the state AG's office does in the environment and energy space. So I have an office of about 750 people, 380 of whom are lawyers. 26 of those lawyers do environmental protection work, and I have 4 lawyers who do public utilities work. So in addition to doing the environmental protection docket, we also have the responsibility to represent ratepayers in front of our Public Utility Commission. And so that causes some really interesting dynamics, as you can imagine, but very important ones. So there are a number of points that I want to make to you today. And so the first one you're aware of, and I've highlighted a little bit, which is that progress in this arena can be slow, but nonetheless, when you look at it over time, we are always moving forward. And so let's go back to 2003 when I started. Really then as now, we had a presidential administration who was closely aligned with the fossil fuel industry. And we also were in a situation where, because of that, we had a federal administration that was not dedicated to upholding our environmental laws, and they were really under siege at the time. So Illinois, then as now, also ended up joining coalitions with other states, New York, Maryland, Massachusetts, and we were working to oppose illegal or inadequate environmental rulemakings. And let's hope then, as now, we ended up winning most of the cases. And we pushed for real progress. David mentioned the Mass versus EPA case that Illinois joined as, I think, the only Midwestern state to join that case. But it ultimately led to the landmark U.S. Supreme Court decision in 2007 holding that greenhouse gases are pollutants and that they do need to be regulated. So I think one of the questions for possibly some of our colleagues who may not be in the room, but I think need to be convinced about why to prioritize this work, I'm going to give you the framework that I use, and the framework that I use really for virtually every matter that comes before me. And I always start with the law. And so, are we correct on the legal analysis? When we look at the law, I would say the answer is yes. I would also say that in Illinois, and I don't know if this is true in other states, our most recent constitution was adopted in 1970. And so it actually has an article dedicated to environment and environmental protection, and the fact that people in the state of Illinois have a right to a healthful environment, and that is our duty to promote that. And so it is good to have that. Second, I end up looking at the facts. And so in this circumstance, right, we're looking at science, we're looking at the data, and I think it is very clear that the scientific information that we are receiving says that we need to act to protect the environment and to forestall further climate change. Third, look at the economics of it. And when you do that, you really see a correlation where the history shows that cleaner environment tracks with economic growth. So when we have pollution going down, we have GDP going up. In addition, in terms of a responsibility to consumers, obviously seeing decreased costs for them in healthcare and other arenas is an important economic factor to look at. And finally, I believe, as hopefully everybody in this room believes, and as the woman from Hawaii talked about at length this morning, we have a moral obligation to do this work on behalf of future generations who will come to inherit our planet. So I want to say this. I think there is real reason for optimism It may not seem that way, but again, I can tell you from the perspective that I've seen almost over the past 15 years that while progress is slow and it is incremental, sometimes aggravatingly so and detrimentally so, we have absolutely seen significant progress taking place. So let me give you a couple of examples. The first one I want to talk about is mercury regulation from coal-fired power plants. So for those of you who are old enough, and a few of us are, you'll remember that it was the 1990 amendments to the Clean Air Act that ordered US EPA to study whether to regulate mercury and other hazardous air pollutants from power plants. It was in the late 1990s, under the Clinton administration, where the US EPA did decide that regulation of mercury was something that was appropriate and necessary. Now, we get to 2005, we get to the Bush administration, where then the US EPA decides to reverse itself, and they ultimately came up with what I would say is both an inadequate and an unworkable rule for mercury emissions, CAMR, so the Clean Air Mercury Rule. Our state coalition opposed this, and ultimately the courts rejected it in 2008, which led to the Obama administration in 2012 being able to develop MATS, the Mercury and Air Toxic Standards. Again, lengthy litigation that went up and down from the US Supreme Court, but ultimately we prevailed, and now we have plants that are complying with those standards. So it's important to look at the history to know that while we do need to come together and we do need to fight back and we do need to move forward, history would tell us that we are going to win the war. I want to give you another example that is in some ways more close to home, but will also show you, sometimes 25 years is a long time, but sometimes it might even be 50-year time span. So in the Chicago area, we've had to do an enormous amount of work in terms of flooding and wastewater issues. And so some background for those of you who aren't familiar with this, but Chicago, as you know, sits on the lovely shores of Lake Michigan. It's essentially a city built on a marshland. And so over the years, probably from the beginning, we have had significant challenges when it comes to dealing with polluted rivers and flooding problems. And we have a combined sewer system where all of our sanitary waste, everything all comes together. And we've had a lot of combined sewer overflows. That's a really nice way of saying something gross. And so in 1975, there was work started to put in place a tunnel and reservoir project that we refer to as TARP. It was created by the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, and the idea was to try to deal with flooding issues and these combined sewer overflows. It's been a massive, multi-decade project. And the several stages of construction had taken place 25 years in. We're at the year 2000, and we are still seeing significant problems with flooding, significant problems with CSOs, and because of that, violations of water quality standards. So one of the things that my office did was to join with US EPA and to work to enter a consent decree against the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District to actually put in place an enforceable schedule for this TARP project. So there are now deadlines that need to be met. One took place in 2015, one takes place at the end of the year, and one takes place in 2029. So over 50 years, but eventually we will have over 100 miles of underground tunnels. We will have a $10 billion or 10 billion gallon storage capacity for flooding and for these overflow events that happen during significant rain events. I think it will be the largest storage capacity anywhere in the country. So I know 25 years seems like a long time. Maybe we don't have 50 years on some of these things, but again, this is an instance where state attorneys general can play a role to intervene, and history shows us that ultimately we will be able to succeed. And because of the cleaner water that we will be having, because one of the other things that we worked on in 2015 was a disinfection project for the Chicago rivers. We really are now able to revision what can be done with the Chicago rivers. Sometimes you hear folks talk about how the Chicago River is now going to be our second waterfront, Lake Michigan obviously being the first. And so there's a lot of work coming in around that. The final example I really want to leave you with, and that I think David is kind of most interested in, really emanates out of the work that we have done over the years regarding our coal-fired power plants. And it really has been a multi-pronged, long-term effort to clean up these large and complex sources and to increase clean energy solutions in Illinois. So the case that you mentioned was our 2005 consent decree with Dynegy, which operated coal-fired power plants in central and southern Illinois. And so that is enforcement work that was begun under the Clinton administration, but then had been threatened under the Bush administration. So ultimately, we worked to get Dynegy to agree to over, I think it was over $500 million in terms of doing cleanup at plants, installing pollution controls, as well as putting in place a number of SEPs. A number of other things we did is that in 2007, we had worked with regulators and the legislature to ultimately enact regulations for coal plant emissions. And so multi-pollutant standards giving coal plants additional time for their mercury controls if they also cleaned up their SO2 and NOx pollution. I will say that that has required constant vigilance to actually hold companies up to their cleanup agreements, but we have been able to move forward. Something that I want to talk about more in the Q&A, we also did some work in 2009. Again, it was new source review violations against Midwest Gen, who was operating 2 coal-fired power plants actually inside the city of Chicago in predominantly Latino neighborhoods that US EPA, our office, community groups, a lot of effort came around to a successful closure, ultimately, of those. We've also been involved in permitting, the Title V permits, working to make sure that they get out from being stayed on appeal and actually are fully updated. And then in addition, as we have seen our older coal plants being retired, we have been increasing renewable energy and energy efficiency efforts. We were really one of the drivers and leaders of that in 2007 and updated that just last year in 2016. And that has allowed Illinois, it was interesting to see people show us kind of their generation mixes, but it's allowed Illinois to go from a situation where in 2003 we had 50 megawatts coming from wind, where now we have over 4,000. So we have seen significant progress made. And so where do we go from here? Again, I think we ultimately are winning. And obviously, it's much more fun. It's much better to be able to play offense than to play defense. But as we see, you know, the pushback from incumbent industries and other entrenched interests, we're back on the defense. But that doesn't mean we're going to lose. And so right now, we really have to fight these rollbacks, and we have to insist that the laws be followed, especially on administrative rulemakings. But as Eric said, it is absolutely vital that we keep moving forward. And as state attorneys general, we have a lot of tools. It's not just litigation, right? But we also have the ability to make arguments in policy venues, such as our state legislatures, our state utility commissions, and before federal agencies on environmental protection, on climate change, and certainly on clean energy. So I am very, very pleased to see this new center come together, and again, thank everybody who was part of this to make sure that we have good lawyers and good lawyering taking place, because it's absolutely vital to understand, you know, the interaction and the complexities in these areas, and it will certainly allow many more of our offices to be able to take leadership roles and for our coalition to expand its coverage. So I thank you for inviting me to be here today, and I look forward to hearing questions. Thank you. And it is my turn to introduce to you the Maryland AG, Brian Frosh, as we all play musical chairs poorly.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to be here. Ricky, thank you very much for the invitation, and David, thank you to you too. Hi to Dan Ferger, great to see you. Let me tell you a short story, give you a little bit of a window into what it's like to be a public official. I was at a ceremony a couple of years ago at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, and up on a dais with a number of other elected officials in front of an audience of several hundred people. And we stood at the beginning to say the Pledge of Allegiance. And when the pledge was finished, there was a color guard at the rear of the audience. And I guess because there were elected officials up on the dais, they fired a salute. And you could see all the heads in the audience swivel around and look at these guys shooting their rifles when the first shots rang out. And when they fired the last shots and shouldered their arms, again, heads swiveled around, they look up at us standing on the dais. There was a moment of hushed silence. I heard this woman in the front row say, "My God, they missed." So, it's rough out there, folks. Despite the fact that I am vastly older than Lisa and somewhat older than Eric, I'm the baby Attorney General here. I was elected in 2014, and I am not doing the job that I ran for. When I was elected, I expected to serve with a Democratic governor. That's not what I got. Larry Hogan, a Republican, was elected. And I had, as David mentioned, for many years championed environmental legislation in the General Assembly. And Maryland, I think, has been one of the leaders in the country in environmental protection. We have passed heroic measures, mostly organized around our preservation of the Chesapeake Bay, but for clean air, for clean water, for climate change, we've led the way. And I had expected and hoped to enforce the laws that I had sponsored when I was in the General Assembly, to enforce them as Attorney General. Unfortunately, Governor Hogan does not share my philosophy about environmental protection, and his philosophy is that he believes in compliance assistance when there are violations of the law. What that means is that if somebody is caught polluting, the Department of Environment goes to that person and says, you know, we really wish you would cut that out. And sometimes that works. But our department, like the rest of our state government, has suffered from cuts ever since that little financial incident in 2008. The government funding in Maryland has gone down. We're $9 or $10 billion less in funding for state government today than we were in 2008. And what that means is if you're an inspector in the Water Management Administration of the Department of Environment in Maryland, your caseload has tripled. The inspectors in the Water Management Administration have about 1,100 permits that they're supposed to look at. And theoretically, they get there every year, but in fact, they don't. They get there every 5 years or every 6 years. And so if you show up after 5 years and say, ooh, you know, you guys are polluting, would you please stop? What it means is that that industry has essentially 10 or 12 years in which they can pollute before any action is going to be taken against them. It puts honest businesses at a competitive disadvantage. I think it's a terrible policy. I found also that the budget in Maryland is constructed such that, well, the attorneys who represent the Department of Environment are assistant attorneys general and work for me. Their salaries are in the budget of the Department of Environment. And that means I don't have the ability to pull them off of cases that they are working on or advice they're giving to the Department of Environment and assign them to my environmental priorities. I have difficulty in, there is what we call assistant capture, because they not only have their salaries in the budget of the Department of Environment, they live and work down the hall from the Secretary of Environment, and despite our very earnest and strong blandishments, end up becoming sympathetic to, or at least accepting of the priorities of the department. The second problem that I encountered is one that has been mentioned a number of times already in this panel, and that is the election of Donald Trump on November 8th last year. And parenthetically, let me mention, I got an email from a friend of mine who lives in Massachusetts on November 9th. And he said, you know, the same day that Donald Trump was elected president, Massachusetts legalized marijuana. He said, I guess the message is when they go low, we get high. But there is not enough, I don't think Massachusetts is capable of producing enough marijuana to make the policies. You get the point. So this created additional problems for me in many respects, one of which is that unlike most of the other attorneys general in the United States, the Maryland Attorney General does not have common law powers. And what that means is that while Eric and Lisa can sue on behalf of New York and Illinois when they find their waters or their air threatened by actions of the federal government or anybody else, the Attorney General of Maryland cannot. It's one of the reasons why I can't take my AGs in the Department of Environment and tell them, okay, look, I don't care what the secretary says. I want you to bring charges against that company. I have to get the governor's permission, or I have to get the General Assembly's permission. So when President Trump signed the first Muslim ban executive order, I asked the governor for permission to join with my colleagues to seek to enjoin those actions, and I heard nothing. So I turned to the General Assembly and I said, look, we got a problem. Will you give me the authority, not just for the Muslim ban, but to sue the federal government, to sue on actions that are related to federal issues on behalf of Marylanders? And they did it very quickly, I mean, in record time for a legislature. By the time the second Muslim ban executive order had been signed, we had the authority to join. And so I have been riding on the coattails of Eric Schneiderman and Lisa Madigan ever since on a series of issues, many of which relate to protecting our environment. And Eric has run through many of them, but the point that I want to emphasize is that we have two problems. We have an authority problem and a resource problem. And this is why the new Bloomberg Center is so vital, I think, to myself and many of my colleagues. I don't have somebody, when I see the Trump administration try to postpone the mercury and air toxics rule or the methane rule or fail to enforce the federal law, I don't have a body that I can turn to and say, okay, look, here's your full-time job for the next 6 months, year, 2 years. Go get them. And having the Bloomberg Center fund resources for attorneys general is critical to me. It's critical to most of my colleagues. You know, there's a quote from Harry Truman that rings in my ears continuously these days. He said in 1948, he said, "Selfish men have always tried to skim the cream of our natural resources to satisfy their own greed, and their instrument has been the Republican Party." And I say that with apologies to the Ruckelshaus Republicans in the room, and even to the Nixon Republicans in the room, because what we have today, as Eric and Lisa have both pointed out, is something vastly different from anything that we've seen before in the history of our country, I believe. You know, well, you know, we have people leading the agencies. Scott Pruitt, who was, when he was Attorney General of Oklahoma, the lapdog for the fossil fuel industry, and I say that with great reverence and respect for lapdogs. Secretary of Interior Zinke just yesterday said his job is to speed up the permitting for logging, for coal mining, for oil drilling, and he said 30% of the people in his agency do not honor the flag. Have Rex Tillerson, who is the CEO of Exxon Mobil, in charge of our foreign policy. The NRDC, I think, aptly called a memo that the president signed last March, I think it was, the Climate Destruction Plan. And I think that's exactly where we're headed. You can see, notwithstanding the evidence that smacked us literally in the face with the hurricanes in Houston, in Florida, in the Caribbean, we're seeing an administration that is absolutely determined to drill every last bit of oil out of the ground, drag every last piece of coal out of every mountain that they can knock down, and an administration that literally rejects science, not just the rule of law, which is extraordinary, but also science itself. I think we're in a very, very difficult time, and I'm glad that there are folks who are optimistic, and I admire them for that. I'm worried, and yet determined. I can tell you that my office and my colleagues will continue to fight. We'll continue to try to protect our natural resources. We will stand up for science. We'll continue to sue the bastards. And we will do everything we can to make sure that every single American has clean air to breathe and clean water to drink. Thank you very much.
Well, that was terrific. Just a reminder that the State Impact Center is nonpartisan. But we are progressive. So I thought I would ask a few questions of our panel and give them a chance to expound a little bit on some of the points that they made, and I have a raft of questions here, and keep them coming. I thought I would ask the three AGs, all of whom are elected officials, what the public mood is out there about these issues of climate change, environment, and clean energy. You know, the traditional polling on these issues is that they are, not up on the top rung. And as elected officials, just wondering if you're seeing any changes in terms of public perception on these issues, how you justify in your prioritization of issues, these issues being up at the top or near the top. if they are, they seem to be. So, Eric, how about you to start on that?
Thank you. Well, I certainly in New York, I feel that the overwhelming majority of people are in favor of strong protections of the environment. We have very ambitious carbon reduction standards of our own. We have renewable portfolio standards. We are a part of a whole group of states that joined, cities and major private corporations in this We Are Still In program after the president withdrew us from the Paris Accord, saying, no, we're going to continue to push forward and to try and go ahead. And I think nationally, the polling more recently that I've seen reflects, well in excess of 70% of the American people think we should absolutely be dealing with greenhouse gases, regulating CO2. Separating out for a moment, I mean, the commitment to clean air and clean water, I think is strong. It does run up in isolated circumstances to this false dichotomy between economic development and protecting the environment. I think enough people have realized that the future, and enough investors and investment advisors realize the future is a green energy economy, and we have to get out and show leadership on that. On climate, though, I think there has been a real transformation of public consciousness in recent years, and these extreme weather incidents confirm it, but it is certainly, and particularly with young people, and young people get older if they're lucky, and as they grow up, that they carry that with them. There was a certain sense of, certainly my daughters and her friends, almost of a little bit of despair, thinking, you guys have screwed this up for us. I found that since the election, the level of energy of sense of that we have to do something about this, that we can do something about this, has turned that around. But I think there is tremendous popular support for what we're doing, as reflected in national polling. And you can just feel it out there. I think, and also it's reflected in a tremendous change in a lot of corporate culture. The difference between now and 10 years ago, as far as the way companies view these issues, is extraordinary.
So I think you're accurate in terms of generalized polling that I've seen over the years. I don't think I've seen any polling recently, but it doesn't tend to hit the top, but it's there, and it's always been at a low level. What's interesting to me, and I agree with Eric here, is that I've really seen, I think, a shift and a change over the last 10 to 15 years, where environmental protection has always been an issue of concern, particularly to communities when there is something that goes wrong, there is an incident of some sort. Always been important, though, when you talk to, in Illinois, you talk to farmers, they've had concerns about both environmental protection and then climate change issues, which, continue to be very significant in terms of what their long-term impacts could be there. But I have also seen a growth and an energy coming out of the generations that have come up, who are now even more engaged with the environmental advocacy organizations. And I can just tell from the correspondence and emails that I get that there is a greater and a broader group of people who are concerned and are actually going to not just think about it, but are taking action to demand elected officials get involved in these issues across the board, not just the environmental protection, but in particular climate change, and more so, but still not real high, the clean energy issues as well.
I agree with everything that Eric and Lisa said. I would just say that we see in Maryland evidence of climate change on the ground. Annapolis is the nuisance flood capital of the nation. We had a flood in Ellicott City that killed a couple of people last year. You look at the three super hurricanes that we've just experienced in the United States and United States territories, and the overwhelming scientific consensus. And I think that essentially what you have is the president arguing, who you're going to believe, me or your own eyes.
So switching subjects a little bit, the environment, of course, is writ large, and natural resources are an important piece of environmental protection. I'm wondering if you individually and or with other AGs in your region, for example, see cooperative work dealing with some of the special resources that you may share. The Great Lakes would be an example, Lisa, the Chesapeake Bay. Just any comments about that, and where do you sense that the issue of ecosystem integrity and those special resources, both for aesthetics and for recreation and for cleansing the human soul, are they part of this as well, or is it so? Open-ended question.
Okay.
Mr. Chesapeake Bay, why don't you start?
All right. Well, let me say first, the Chesapeake Bay has been a tremendous organizing tool for environmental initiatives for many years. The Chesapeake Bay Foundation, I think, struck gold when they coined the slogan, "Save the Bay." It's critically important. It's an important part of Maryland's heritage, and for those of you who aren't that familiar with it, let me just quote for you what Captain John Smith wrote in his diary when he sailed into the Chesapeake Bay. He said, "We found, and in diverse places, that abundance of fish lying so thick with their heads above water that for want of nets or barge driving amongst them, we attempted to catch them with a frying pan. But we found it a poor instrument to catch fish with. Neither better fish nor more plenty nor more variety for small fish had any of us ever seen so swimming in the water. But they're not to be caught with frying pans." So that's Maryland's heritage. And, a carpet of fish, essentially. The oyster reefs used to be so numerous and large that they broke the waves, and the entire bay was filtered through oysters once every 3 days. And so Maryland has, as I said a few minutes ago, engaged in heroic efforts to save the bay. We have all kinds of development restrictions, the critical areas law. If you're within 1,000 feet of the bay, you can't develop more than so much, you can't put down more than so much impervious surfaces or develop more than one dwelling in 20 acres. And we adopted vehicle emissions rules piggybacking on California, and pollution rules for utilities that are essentially the precursor to the Clean Power Program. And many others because of the Chesapeake Bay. It's cleaned up our air, it's helped our water get relatively clean. And we've worked with Virginia and Pennsylvania and New York, though it's not part of the Chesapeake Bay Commission, all of those states which are part of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And we've cooperated as attorneys general, but the governors and general assemblies of those jurisdictions have worked cooperatively. And all of that work is threatened essentially by the Waters of the United States rule, by the Clean Power, by the rollback of the Clean Power Plan, and by the other initiatives of the Trump administration. So it's something we're intensely interested in.
Lisa?
So the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes are part of the largest freshwater ecosystem in the world, and very important economic engine for the state of Illinois and the other states that are around the Great Lakes. There is great cooperation and great concern around the fact that in terms of the federal budget that's been proposed, they would zero out the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative that was put in place by President Obama, I think back in maybe 2010. It's funded cleanup, funded us dealing with invasive species, and a number of other really vital issues that even though my colleagues, whether they be state AGs or governors around us, for the most part are Republicans, obviously we have been able to come together around those issues pertaining to the Great Lakes. And so that is a good way for us to try to find some common ground and, work to persuade them about the importance, not just of that specific issue, but of then applying that lens to, the greater issue of environmental protection.
Great.
Well, we have a strong tradition of conservation in New York. We've made a lot of progress, and we've made a lot of progress with some state tools, with a lot of federal tools. I'm sure people here remember when I was young, if you dip your leg in the East River, the Hudson River, your parents would want you to go to the hospital. It was really and we weren't catching fish with frying pans or anything else, not that you would eat. So that's changed a lot, and we have made a lot of progress. But I think Brian already mentioned the Waters of the U.S. rule. This is tremendously important for protecting a lot of our waterways and ensuring that we have the tools to do that. The other thing that is tremendously important is while we watch the daily deluge of these bad ideas that spew out of Washington like some toxic volcano, the process of them moving through a budget that could really have devastating impacts in ways that are a lot more subtle and are getting very little public attention. I mean, the decimation of the funding for environmental programs to clean up brownfields and toxic waste sites, and in New York we still do have a lot of these old industrial sites that need those resources, and just because of the politics of all of the states around it, it's hard for me to believe they will actually zero out, but that was in their original proposal. So the Great Lakes, and Great Lakes are very important in New York too. Lake Erie, Lake Ontario is an important part of our state. So one area that I would urge everyone to be attentive to is we can't take for granted. A lot of people, oh, this is just a proposed budget, it's not going to go anywhere. Any one of these items, if they get through, could have devastating consequences for the tremendous progress that we have made, and I think a lot of states have made.
So let me ask one more general question on the topic of enforcement, and then get to some of the great questions that are coming in here. So the early returns are suggesting that the new administration is not prioritizing enforcement of our environmental laws. It's obviously early, but there have been some early reports suggesting that that will not be a priority. Each of you have broad enforcement actions. Curious about whether you see a bigger caseload for yourselves on the enforcement side. Also, I don't know if, obviously in the Volkswagen case, for example, and others, there have been some cases where there have been joint enforcement efforts. Do you see other areas in which state AGs may step up and do more enforcement on their own nickel, so to speak?
Okay, it's my turn. I don't have a soliloquy, but that was a compliment, actually. You're welcome. But so the answer is yes, we are doing much more jointly with other like-minded state attorneys general in terms of enforcement. But interestingly, in our state, we really do rely on referrals from our agencies. So IEPA, our Department of Public Health, our Department of Natural Resources, sometimes our Emergency Management Agency, often to bring cases. And we are at historic lows. I think in large part because of our governor. So I think last year, maybe we got 79 referrals. During my time as AG, I think our historic high has been about 300. And so now we're down to 75, because I think the year before that it was only about 74. So we are seeing historic lows in terms of referrals, and the challenge that we have is within the AG's office, we don't have the investigators, we don't have the scientists, right? So we don't have the ability to actually do the investigative work necessary to bring those matters on our own, although we do have independent authority. And so that's really a resource challenge that we have had to contend with and may have to work to build up that capacity so that we can do more of the enforcement work independent of our state agencies who traditionally have had that. But we do have the authority to do that. And certainly, you know, this could be a panel on a whole variety of issues, you know, whether it be around the travel ban, where we have come together as state AGs, whether it be around health care. We've been doing an enormous amount of work trying to figure out what's going to happen and if something happens. Reproductive rights is another area where we have been working diligently. And so you'll see, you know, there are probably 12 areas where like-minded state AGs have come together, and, you know, we all take different pieces of it. You know, maybe I'll take a consumer fraud piece, or maybe I'll take, I think we took net neutrality. We're doing a lot of the pushback against the Department of Education and their rollbacks of some very important rules around student borrowers and some of the for-profit institutions that have put people into tremendous debt. So yes, there are a lot of other areas where we have had to come together to move forward.
Yeah, this is a huge challenge, and this is where we have the federal government in many respects is very small compared to the state government. If you look at issues like law enforcement or education or healthcare, most of the resources are actually at the state level. When it comes to environmental enforcement, it's very spotty state by state. We do have broad jurisdiction over these matters. We have not been shy at all about bringing enforcement cases, but the the need for resources is always something pressing. We have made up for that to a certain extent by doing more with technology and by building stronger alliances. And I think the sort of the inspiration since the beginning of this year has been for people to collaborate, whether they're non-for-profits that work in this area or other public agencies, for us to collaborate and cooperate. But there still is a gap, and we have one thing about the folks in power now: they are relentless. They are showering us with bad ideas on a daily basis, and we do have to prioritize. So we definitely are filling in, and resources and coordination are important. And there are a lot of opportunities for people to volunteer and to help out and to plug in with organizations that can also bring citizen suits and fill in some of these gaps as well. But it's going to be a very important time, and and I'm a believer that we're going to, that we are going to succeed, and that people are waking up to this notion that power at the state level is going to be a key protector of our freedoms in a way that people really didn't think about it before. In New York, at any rate, so far, so good. I mean, we're all jealous of California, where I think Jerry Brown gave the AG another $6 million just to keep litigating against the federal government. But that's not coming from for any of the three of us. But we are prepared to rise to the challenge, and it's impossible to overstate the outpouring of at least the desire for support that has been coming up, and the improved level of coordination, and, as Lisa says, dividing projects up so that we can do a better job together.
So let me ask you a quick follow-up on this. This is a little bit wonky, but very important in the enforcement context, I think. You know, traditionally, many environmental enforcement cases are implemented in part with the target company in the settlement doing some good environmental projects, in addition to signing a check that goes into the Treasury. The administration has indicated that they're pulling back from that. Jeff Sessions, in fact, I think forgave a major portion of a settlement. I think it may have been with Harley-Davidson, because they didn't like the notion that part of the settlement could be good environmental projects. And I'm curious about whether AGs have thought about that. I assume that you all use that tool to some extent, both because it returns to the environment some benefit that may have been lost because of whatever triggered the enforcement action. It also promotes good behavior. But you all have any positions on this? So the other quick point on that is that the Interior Department and Secretary Zinke has really denigrated the notion of mitigation as a tool that is used when, for example, a lease is provided that will have some environmental impact. It just strikes me that this might be an issue of interest to the AGs. Curious if it is.
Yeah, I think SEPs are very important. They're almost always part of the relief that we want. They have certainly driven an enormous amount of conservation and remediation and restoration in Illinois. So very disconcerting to hear what AG Sessions has to say and his viewpoint on how we should proceed. Because I always want, right, when we're doing this, you want the remedy to somehow fix the problem that had been caused. And that's why these supplemental environmental projects were always a critical piece, at least to us, and I presume that that's true in virtually every state.
Yeah, I think that's right, and it's something that my impression is that industry likes as well. It's, you know, they write a check and they get smacked around in the press, but if they can do a project that remediates, it gives them credit that they wouldn't otherwise get. So I think it's a terrible mistake to write that kind of program off.
It's important to recognize this is a part of a broader pattern that, and we've seen it in the financial context where I was involved in negotiating a lot of the settlements between the big banks that sold the bad mortgage-backed securities that blew up the economy. And a lot of that money went to housing programs and programs to help provide legal services so people wouldn't get foreclosed on and things like that. And now there are hearings where they're saying, oh, this was going to radical organizations, you know, like legal services groups that stand up for the rights of poor people. And it's very much them elevating ideology over evidence. The evidence is remediation works, programs to actually undo the harm or to get more direct help to the people who are injured work. But this is a part of a broader campaign through the administration to say essentially any of these groups that do good work, whether it is our environmental groups or groups that provide legal services or groups that provide help for housing or healthcare, are somehow tarred with some sort of liberal brush. And it's something we have to be very, very attuned to because it is a critical part of relief in many areas of law. Now, it is also true that they are a long way from passing a federal law to preempt us from being able to do it at the state level. I mean, they may be able to say, okay, a federal agency, as a matter of policy, shouldn't do that anymore, but it doesn't mean we're going to give up at unless they force us to do it, and I have a hard time seeing them doing that.
Good. So I'm going to talk about a couple of specifics that have come through the questions, and Lisa, you mentioned your interest in talking a little bit more about the case of the power plants in the city. Yeah. I should say also we have a cartoon ready to be shown whenever you give me the cue. So will you talk a little bit more about how you work through the issue of the power plants that, as I recall, were located in Hispanic areas where there are real environmental justice issues, and how you work through those issues?
So, you know, whenever we're looking at environmental protection, environmental enforcement, to me, you know, it's always interesting when you have a case model that I think shows kind of the best of how you can have a group of different entities putting pressure on through the various mechanisms or levers that they have to achieve what sometimes seems obvious to be done. So there were two coal-fired power plants actually operating in the city of Chicago within its boundaries up until 2012. The Crawford and Fisk plants, they were owned by Midwest Gen. And one of them had been built right around the turn of the 20th century, I think around 1903. The other one I think maybe a little bit later, but not much. And so emitting all sorts of horrible things and having a very direct impact on the health of the large populations. I mean, again, we're talking about coal-fired power plants within the city of Chicago, right? About 3 million people living there. And so it really started as a grassroots community effort where you had mothers whose children, you know, were experiencing asthma and other respiratory illnesses, who started going to their public officials in particular, who were not overly responsive. Ultimately, US EPA got involved. We joined the US EPA's suit, and I think we had some additional claims. I think there were NSR violations in essence, because they had made some upgrades, I think in the late 90s, early 2000s, and we said, look, you didn't put in place the proper pollution controls at the time. But ultimately what ended up happening through these community groups as well as the lawsuits is that with a very effective communication strategy and political strategy, it became an issue in the 2011 mayoral race, where in essence, these community groups had become so vocal and had gotten the media on their side that they basically made a demand of all of the people running saying, will you assure us that you will shut these plants down? And so when Rahm Emanuel became the mayor, he had to negotiate the closure of these plants. And so it's just interesting because, sometimes it's not going to be an individual lawsuit, whether it's US EPA or whether it's a state attorney general, but I think the most effective model I've seen is something like that. It comes from the grassroots. It's not just one person trying to do something, but when you have real humans who are experiencing a problem, and you're able to have them do so much of the work. And there were, I should also say, and I don't mean to forget these folks, but the environmental organizations, Sierra Club in particular, enormous advocacy work around this. But really, it came from where it was supposed to. It came from the people who were most directly impacted, and then those individuals and organizations that were able to represent them, devise strategies where we could, and ultimately got these plants closed where they shouldn't have been operating in the first place.
Great. And Eric, we've got a couple of questions about the Exxon suit. And folks would like an update on where things stand. And also, one questioner noted how much of a resource challenge this must be, this litigation, given the pushback that you've had to deal with. So if you could give us an update and give us any other observations about that suit that you can, we'd love to hear it.
Sure. This is an investigation that we started in late 2015, and we started it at the conclusion of a successful investigation against what was then the largest publicly held coal company in the world. And the theory of the investigation was not to pursue violations of environmental laws, but to look at whether fossil fuel companies were misrepresenting overstating their assets and understating their risks based on what their knowledge was of climate change and of probable government actions in response to climate change. And there were companies out there collectively claiming that they had trillions and trillions of dollars of assets that none of which would be left in the ground. They would all be used and sold at a profit. And scientists told us that even if a fraction of them were actually used, there'd be no one left to burn the rest. So clearly someone was lying about using up all of their coal and oil and gas supplies. So we had a successful investigation into Peabody Coal, found that they were making misrepresentations about the climate change and government action in response to climate change and how it would affect their business model. They said, we give up, and they rewrote all their financials, and then, as so many coal companies have, went into Chapter 11. And we then issued a subpoena to Exxon, and the remarkable thing about it has been the vehemence of the response. All we are doing is seeking to see if they were making misstatements to shareholders, regulators, and the public about what they knew internally about climate science and what it was likely to mean about the future consumption of their fossil fuels. They sued us, and my counterpart in Massachusetts, Maura Healey, also issued a subpoena. We were just at the stage of issuing subpoenas, by the way. And never before in the history of the United States have state law enforcement officers issuing subpoenas been met with what we were met with. They sued us in Texas to try and get an injunction against us, alleging this was an improper political effort to stifle dissenting views on climate change. So I am stifling Exxon's First Amendment rights to communicate what it thinks about climate change. They went to a congressional committee, which has threatened to hold us in contempt of Congress. There was actually a hearing where it was discussed, you know, they turned the old jail here in the House into a cafeteria back in the 30s. If we did arrest these AGs, where would we put them? This was actually discussed in a hearing. And they have adopted a policy of aggressively pressing out their counter-argument, which is that this is not a legitimate law enforcement inquiry. It is a politically charged effort to punish an industry we disagree with and to push our views on climate in the face of valid dissenting views. So they have launched the full propaganda machinery, everything exposed in the great work that was done on dark money and the full-page ads taken out in the New York Times by the Competitive Enterprise Institute, Petroleum Institute, ALEC, all of your, I'm sure, many organizations that people here are involved with. And it really has been resistance. We have won pretty much everything we have had to come up against in terms of them resisting document production. We just won a major victory last week requiring Exxon to produce the records of its accountants. But their strategy is delay and deflect and counterattack. And in the war of public opinion, they've been doing a pretty good job because they do have the ability to generate we have great support from environmental groups, but our communications abilities are far more limited. I mean, they probably outdo us 20-1 in terms of op-ed columns and editorials attacking us. So we've been winning on the merits. We've gotten massive document production so far. We've actually been moved on to be able to take some depositions. We've been able to flesh out in our court papers, and they are available online, some more details of the nature of the fraud as we've gathered more documents. But they have shown no sign of backing down. Interestingly enough, for the first time ever, they then did agree to take an impairment, which is an accounting term used in securities laws, acknowledging that there might be some reduction in value of some of their reserves. And we think we are making a lot of progress, particularly in recent months, in turning this around. But the investigation goes forward. There have been other cases brought challenging fossil fuel companies for damage to the environment, damage to local governments that really parallel ours in terms of theory, looking at what they knew and what their potential liability was. So I think things are moving in the right direction. It's just going to be a slower process than we would realize. We're hopeful that the federal case they brought against us will be dismissed in the next 60 days or so, and that'll be an important inflection point. But we are seeking support, and we particularly need support in the area of the court of public opinion, because in most regional media markets, the only thing they've heard is this story that there are these rogue AGs conspiring with radical environmentalists to suppress dissenting views on those who dare to challenge climate change orthodoxy, as they have put it in some of their pieces. So it's been a wild ride, but on the merits of anytime we actually get to court and then get to the appeal, because they always appeal, we have been winning, and we will continue to persevere, and we do think we're right. We don't think they are adopting the scorched earth strategy because they have nothing to hide.
Well, and that might be a good time to show the cartoon.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think what'll be up here.
There it is.
So my husband is a cartoonist, and that's one of his cartoons that ran earlier this year as one of the New Yorker's daily cartoons. And maybe it was better at the point of David asking us the question of, well, what does the public think about environmental protection and climate change? I think that's what they think, because it was one of the most popular cartoons that he ran during that time.
That's great. So, well done. Well done. I want to ask one final question of Brian Frosh, just as the moderator's prerogative, because Brian has led the lawsuit against the Trump administration on the emoluments clause. This is a largely legal audience. Would be really interested to get a little bit of an update on that, Brian.
I'm glad to have a legal audience. So the emoluments clauses in the Constitution are our nation's original anti-corruption law. The Foreign Emoluments Clause says that no federal official can accept any present or emolument, whatever, from any foreign state. The Domestic Emoluments Clause says that the president can receive his salary and no other emolument from the United States or any of them any other state. And by the way, the president gets paid $400,000 a year, about 7 times what the average American family has in income, has an expense account of about $200,000, an Air Force One, in the White House, free food, free booze, et cetera. So it's not a bad deal. It's not a bad gig for most people. But Donald Trump has tried to use the presidency as a platform to make Trump rich again. And it goes from marketing the Trump Post Office Hotel, the hotel near the White House, to the diplomatic community, and very successfully. They doubled the room rates after he was sworn in, and they're marketing heavily to the diplomatic community and getting all kinds of business from them. It includes him receiving payments in New York from his properties here from Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, China, Qatar, and a number of other foreign governments. They doubled the initiation fees at Mar-a-Lago, what he calls the summer White House, or the southern White House, from $100,000 to $200,000. And this one is, I think, maybe most illustrative of the dangers of having a president who is profiteering from the office. Trump had sought trademark protection for his name in China from 2006 on. And it was repeatedly denied throughout the Chinese court system. Denied. As you may remember, while he was campaigning, he said that the United States might not continue the one China policy. You might recognize Taiwan. And in fact, after he was elected, he called the president of Taiwan violating our foreign policy of many years. And finally, I think it was on February 9th, he met with President Xi of China. And in that meeting, he said that the United States would continue to honor the one China policy. And 5 days later, he got his trademark approved in China. And since then, a number of other trademarks approved in China. So, I mean, you can see the potential for abuse. You can see the threat to our governmental policy by someone who ignores the emoluments clauses and seeks to profit from the office of the presidency. So we filed suit in the Southern District of Maryland with Carl Racine, the Attorney General for the District of Columbia. The government's response to our lawsuit is due this week, maybe the beginning of next week. We expect a motion to dismiss. We expect that they will say that we don't have standing. And let me just say that, Maryland, as many of you know, was one of the 13 original states. And one of the Maryland has in its constitution language very similar to the emoluments clauses. And the 13 original colonies were very concerned about ceding sovereignty to a federal government because they were afraid that a president might favor a foreign country or favor another state over one of those states. And we have, in effect, consideration for joining the Union, and it was the emoluments clauses. So we are optimistic that we have standing, and we think on the merits it's a winner.
So let's thank our terrific panel.
Thank you. I just want to add my thanks to David for moderating this wonderful panel, to the 3 attorneys general. Your presence here this afternoon means so much to the Institute for Policy Integrity and to NYU Law School, and we all really look forward to working together. It was an inspiring afternoon, and I'm enormously grateful. Thank you so much.